It's Saturday, February 14th, and we have what I think could be a pretty substantial severe weather outbreak on the horizon today. This is going to be for all hazards, with the strongest of our activity centered on the Gulf Coast of Texas, Louisiana, parts of eastern Texas, and the majority of Louisiana altogether. We also have a marginal risk, which expands out much further, covering a decent portion of Texas, stretching all the way back into central and even western parts. And this also stretches up into southern portions of Oklahoma and even into southern portions of Mississippi. This is once again going to be for all hazards. And I think one of the main things with this is going to be a pretty nasty nocturnal spin up tornado threat in our main risk area. We also have a broader 2% chance for a couple of weaker spin up tornadoes, and that's going to last all throughout the day. Same thing with the wind. When we see that maximized tornado potential, we're also going to see maximized potential for some damaging winds, maybe even up to 60 to 75-mile-hour gusts in a couple of areas. And of course, we have that widespread risk. And there's also just a widespread general threat for some hail. Nothing too big, though. I don't really think we're going to see anything over 2 inches. And this risk is literally going to last all day. It's going to start in the very, very early morning hours today, stretching all the way into the very early morning hours tomorrow, Sunday morning. And it's going to pretty much follow this arrow starting in West Texas and going all the way into parts of Mississippi. We're going to see a couple of cells fire off in the Permian Basin in West Texas in the very, very early morning hours before the sun is even up, probably close to 3 a.m. These could potentially pose a threat for some damaging winds, some hail, maybe close to 2 inches in diameter. And I think that tornado risk, it's not zero, but it's going to be pretty close to it. But definitely some stronger thunderstorms with this. Then when the sun comes up, we could potentially see that low level jet kick in when we see the sunrise, fueling these storms even more. And then they'll all cluster and interact when we see those storm interactions, also potentially making them stronger momentarily into a bit of a line. When this happens, we could see a bit of a damaging wind threat. Now, this is actually going to taper off this activity after the morning hours. We could potentially see a Boeing segment. Really, anywhere in this line has the potential to produce damaging winds at that point. And then things are going to calm down for a bit. Now, these are still going to be really strong storms. So we're going to start to see a lot of messy convection in front of this. Now, this is kind of a double-edged sword, because when these kind of blips in front of the line impact the line, we see storm interactions potentially making the storms stronger and even potentially making them weaker in some cases. But we're going to bet that they could make them stronger, always erring on the side of caution there. And the ingredients are going to be really, really good. When I show you the photographs and the weather soundings later in the video, you're just going to see how absurd our shear parameters are. So really, this line all the way from a couple hours before 12 until the late afternoon. The late afternoons when we're really going to see things start to kick off is going to have the potential for some damaging winds and maybe even a couple of spin up tornadoes. I also want to point out a hallmark or a big point of this setup is our shear parameters are almost parallel to our line. Whenever we see that, that's a much better indication that we could have some spin up tornadoes. And then we also have all of these storm mergers and interactions right here. But this messy convection leaves a lot of questions on how much activity we'll actually see before we reach the late afternoon. But once we reach the late afternoon, not only are we going to have the low level jet kick in from the sunset, but we're actually going to see a clearing out in front of our line in our main risk area. This is pretty much what our slight risk area is from the Storm Prediction Center. I pretty much agree with on this forecast fully, and we're going to see it clear out, and we're just going to see a explosion of activity in this line. It's important to not forget about this stuff more up north, closer to that low pressure system, though. Even though we're still seeing some messy storm modes up there in less instability, still the potential for damaging winds and a couple of spin up tornadoes. But that's going to be our main line at this point. We're seeing potentially wind gust up to 70, 75 miles an hour. Some small hail. That hail threat is really going to taper down at this point because our line is going to be such a well-defined linear storm mode. And when we see that, that really diminishes the chance of hail. Wouldn't rule it out, though. Maybe we see something in excess of 1 inch, but that's probably going to be pretty much it. At this point, it's just a nocturnal tornado threat and a damaging wind threat. And as you can see, this is going to go all the way into Sunday morning tomorrow. This is going to be a long lasting line lasting all the way through the night. So definitely want to stay weather aware if you're in any of these areas, and be aware for alerts if you do get them in the night while you're sleeping. And this is our jet stream. This is one of the main players in why we're seeing this setup. And we're noticing a pretty sharp wave moving through. You see this red right here. That's indicative of some stronger forcing. Probably one of the reasons why we're getting a more linear storm mode, because that forcing is going to be quite a bit stronger. Not really going to be a glancing blow, but it's going to be more head on. And this is one of the reasons why we're seeing such good deep layer shear. One of the reasons why we're able to see these storms last for so long, be so organized, and have the potential to produce some hail even above 1.5 inches, even though these storm modes are going to be fairly linear. But now we're going to move into that deep analysis, and this is starting in the far morning hours in the Permian Basin in western Texas, when we see those first cells pop off and what's going to be our long lasting, eventually a very strong line. Couple of things to note: pretty good cape in this shear profile in our photograph. We already see a bit of a curve throughout the day. This is only going to get crazier and crazier, and it's going to be almost textbook by the time we're looking at it in the later afternoon. And then we see our photograph kind of extend out, indicative of that super awesome. These are really, really good values for deep layer shear, almost 70 knots. I definitely think these storms will have the chance to produce some hail, especially with this profile in the upper levels. We see a decent bit of cape up here, and then also really solid lapse rates as you go up. Something to note is that at the surface, really, really stable profile, 60-degree dew point, 60-degree temperature. Whenever we see that, that means that tornadoes are probably going to be out of play. So even though we have these really good shear parameters, over 100 SRH, over 20 knots of low level shear, and even though our storms could potentially be surface based, there is still going to be a lot of convective inhibition at this time in the early morning hours. And because it's going to be so stable at the surface, I think the main thing to look for here is going to be some hail, potentially being large, and some damaging winds. And now we're shifting into what our soundings looking like in the midday, when we're seeing that really messy mode, leaving a lot of questions. But overall, our ingredients are still going to be really favorable for severe weather. Starting with our shear parameters have improved even more. We're seeing close to 40 knots of low level shear. I think this is almost definitely going to mean that we're going to see some damaging winds in the midday. We even see a really pronounced curvature in the low levels of our photograph, even extending out more. This is really, really indicative of some very good shear parameters. Our deep layer shear is still close to 60 knots. These shear parameters are essentially going to carry this storm mode, as at this point, because we're having such a messy mode, it's almost eating up all of the instability in front of it. And even our precipitable water is quite high, close to 1.6 inches. I think at this point in the day, it's going to primarily be a damaging wind threat. I think we could see 60 to 70 mile an hour gust at that point, probably closer to 60 mile an hour. But because our storms are likely going to be a bit higher based midday, that tornado threat isn't going to be a slam dunk. It's not going to be super high. Definitely would not rule it out though, because our shear parameters are going to be so, so good. And we're even eventually starting to see a little bit more instability at the surface, still looking like a pretty stable profile in the first 3 kilometers of the atmosphere. And now we're moving into when things are really going to start to get real in the late afternoon hours to evening into the night. Pretty much this is going to last all the way through the night as it pushes west to east from eastern Texas into Louisiana, into Mississippi. And the first thing to note is that our shear parameters are going to be super duper good, almost 500 surface relative helicity, 40 knots of low level shear, and nearly 70 knots of upper level shear. These shear parameters are pretty much off the charts, and we see a really pronounced curve in the lower levels of our photograph. These are super good parameters for shear, definitely going to lead to the strongest risk of damaging winds, strongest risk of tornadoes. Definitely these storms are going to be surface based at this point. We are even seeing wind veering in the lower levels. Now, the main hindrance for this event, why it's not going to be just a complete craziness of tornadoes and damaging winds, is because our instability, it's not quite all there. We definitely could see it be better, but at this point, we're seeing a bit of a baby inverted V profile at the surface that's going to lead to a much greater chance for those stronger spin ups. And even at the higher levels, we're seeing much better lapse rates than we were, let's say, in the very beginning of the day. So even though our instability isn't quite all there, our shear parameters are going to be so good. We're going to have enough moisture, and our instability will probably be close to 500 cape. I definitely think we're going to see a pretty strong risk of a nocturnal spin up tornado threat in this line, as well as a pretty strong damaging wind threat as well.